I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I'm Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman, and you are here to listen to us talk at length about the finer points of face punching. We plan to do so. So, Pat, you know how on episode 170 I had a ton of puns and it was really good and it was my best intro ever?
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Okay.
I do.
There wasn't as much enthusiastic support from you on that response as I'd hoped for, but so I spent a long time for that coming up with puns. And I couldn't come up with one for the Cyborg Avenger fight, but I did want to share with you an image that popped in my head while I was trying to brainstorm puns for Cyborg Avenger. It's, imagine, Marvel's newest summer blockbuster, The Avengers, okay? And it's just a team of like 6 Tanya Avengers who beat the Hulk by breaking his hands with their chins. Is that something? Is that good?
I mean, we're workshopping it.
Yeah, I don't have a special intro for this episode, so that's it. You get the leavings of one of my best intros. Welcome to Heavy Hands. I'm Connor Ruebusch. Patrick Wyman's here with me. Today we have a sort of mixed bag of topics to talk about. We have a great question from one of our most stalwart and supportive patrons, Ben Cohn. We're going to get to that at the end of the show and talk about the best unranked fighters. Mostly in the UFC is what we're going to focus on, but basically the best guys who, despite not being in the top 10 of their divisions, we could easily see them giving even the champion of their division a competitive fight and surprising a lot of other good guys with on a good night with a win. We're going to get to that at the end of the show, but before that, we want to spend the first half, the bulk of the show, talking about training camps. We bring up a lot of training camps on this show. You will often hear us say words like Jackson Wink, like Tristar, like ATT, like AKA, like Kings and Rafael Cordeiro, so on and so forth. But we kind of wanted to, do a power rankings and sort of come to the conclusion of which of the big teams, which of the big camps in the world of MMA is producing the best fighters, which is, if it's possible to be objective, which is objectively the best, which ones do we like the best, and what do each of them do better than the others, where are their strengths and weaknesses. There are so many, it seems increasingly like that's a very big part of the story when you talk about a fighter these days. If you're talking about an ATT fighter, it matters that they're an ATT fighter when you're having that analytical conversation. And so let's give people a brief rundown, I guess, before we get started, Pat. What are the kind of teams that we're looking at? What are our criteria for a big team or a big camp?
Well, so I think that we need to take a quick step back because there are basically 2 models, I would say, for how MMA is being run right now. There is a kind of a big team model that you see exemplified with places like I think American Top Team is the quintessential like type specimen of this example. I think Jackson Wink is another one, and these are full service places where you go and everything is under the same roof. You've got all your coaches there. You've got all the services that you need. You're getting game planning. You're getting collaborative instruction from a whole bunch of different people. Then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the auteur type coaches. So like I think that Matt Hume is the best example of this. Though even though they do everything at AMC Pancration, like it's still Matt Hume's team.
And,
like it is his place.
It's almost like some of those teams are limited by the personalities of the coaches or by their desires. Like they don't necessarily want to take on a ton of students, or maybe not a lot of students gel with them, but you have these coaches who, while like no one would say that Matt Hume knows less about MMA than even a team of 3 coaches at ATT, but not everybody's going to get along with Matt Hume or learn from him the way that somebody like Demetrius Johnson can.
You've got to be a Matt Hume guy,
right.
or I think maybe a slightly less extreme example of that would be Rafael Cordeiro in Kings, where that is not a full service gym. You have to go like you're going to do grappling there, you're going to do wrestling there, you're most of all going to do striking there, but you still need to go someplace to have a wrestling coach or to have a grappling coach. But those bonds tend to be loose rather than everything being all under one roof. Like people don't understand. Like Kings is a tiny little facility. Like it is barely big enough to have like a bunch of bags, mat space, and a cage. Like, and that's all it is. It's very small. Tristar too, same deal. Like, I think Tristar is way closer to the single auteur type of coach than it is to being a big full service facility, even though you can get most of what you need there.
I want to ask before we get into it, I want to ask a question about the way MMA is trained. Do you think that it's because there's so many specializations that go into it? Is that the reason we don't have the kind of structure with gyms that exists in boxing? Because in boxing, even today, gyms are kind of famous, not necessarily like the one guy who heads up that gym. There are certainly a lot of celebrity trainers, but like throughout history, you go to Stillman's gym, you go to Kronk gym. Yeah, you might be going there so that you can work with Angelo Dundee or work with Manny Stewart, or you might go to Wildcard so you can work with Freddie Roach. But the average person or the average boxer would also go to Wildcard because that's where they know a lot of good fighters and a lot of good trainers congregate, and you'll find a trainer there. In MMA, it seems very much more structured. Like, you go to ATT, you're probably going to work with the ATT team. You are. And you can obviously go outside, like people like Tyron Woodley and Robbie Lawler have done that. Ioane and Jacek still does that. But you are going there to participate with a team of specific coaches, not just to be in the environment where all of these great things are happening.
It's about the economics of the sport, frankly, because in MMA, you don't have the only way to get access to the pool of coaching that you need, because like you point out, you need a lot of different things. You need people who know wrestling. You need people who know grappling. You need people who know striking. Like, you need all of those different things. And it's really hard for any individual fighter to get all of that on their own. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's becoming more possible now, and we're seeing more and more along those lines where you have camps that are built around an individual. But at this point, I think the basic economics of the sport still, for so many fighters, still dictate, like, you need to go someplace where you're paying your flat trainer's fee, and you're not having to pay all these different people for private lessons.
Yeah, because the basement for cost for an individualized MMA camp, we've said for many years that that's the direction the sport's probably headed in, that probably the best training anyone can get is in a camp that is designed for them. And we've seen success from guys who do that in MMA, and also some non-success, like a Ronda Rousey type camp situation. But do you think the problem, that the reason we probably will never see as many of those in MMA as we do in boxing, is that the basement of cost is automatically way higher? Because
it's just too expensive.
Yeah, because not only are you going to probably bring in more coaches, you're not just going to bring in your cup man and your head trainer and maybe somebody else, but you're not even going to just be able to hire like a half dozen sparring partners in the same way you could for a boxing camp, because the things they need to know to prepare you for your fight are a lot more specific and a lot more varied. And so maybe you'll have a guy who pressures well, but what if he can't wrestle? And the guy you're about to fight wrestles really well. What if he's just a boxer? Well, now you're going to need to find a guy, you know what I mean? Like, all of the layers to the sport itself make finding people who teach and prepare you to deal with those layers way more costly and difficult.
Yeah, and that's kind of the benefit of having the big camp, is that you're going to have all of those different sparring partners under one roof already, so you don't need to go out and find them.
Which is why in MMA, you hear a lot more from fighters who spar with other very well-known fighters. Floyd Mayweather's not going out there in the boxing ring and talking about, like, I know boxers who have sparred with Floyd Mayweather, but he's not out there sparring with, Zab Judah on a regular basis, or sparring with, I don't know, Adrian Broner or somebody. He's sparring with people who are brought in to spar him. Whereas in MMA, like, Jorge Masvidal probably knows kind of how Robbie Lawler fights, because they probably fought each other in the gym a few times.
Yeah, or, I mean, Daniel Cormier and Cain Velasquez have probably taken years off each other's life with their sparring sessions.
The iron sharpens iron mentality of MMA probably is an outgrowth of the fact that big camps are the most efficient way to get things done as a fighter.
Yeah, they have at least proven they have at least a long history in MMA. And at this point, it's not just about what is most effective. It's also, you have built up advantages that accrue to your team by virtue of having existed for a long time. So Jackson Wink has been around in some form or another for 20-something years at this point. Rafael Cordeiro has been doing it for 20-something years at this point. AKA has been around for 15, 18 years. ATT has been around for a long time. Like, when you have those kinds of built-in advantages from name recognition, having been around for a long time, it skews the landscape. So even if there were theoretically another way of doing it, they already have such a lead built up that you may not be able to overcome it. Like, it would take a lot, I think, to totally upend the market of how MMA training works.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's list real quick then, like, what camps we're kind of going to be discussing. Which ones, who's in the conversation? Obviously, go on.
Okay, so I think, to my mind, I think ATT is the best all-around camp in the world right now. Not just because they have a bunch of champions like Ioana Jędrzejczyk and Amanda Nunes, but because they have so many top flight fighters in so many different divisions who fight in a variety of different ways. Like, it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. They game plan really well. Mike Brown, I think, is up there now, or should be in the conversation as one of the very best coaches in MMA, simply because he seems to grasp how all the various pieces of a big camp like ATT should work together.
Yeah, we got to talk to Mike Brown one of these days.
Yeah, we really do need to talk to him. I'm fascinated by what he's putting together. I think Jackson Wink is up there, and it's I think it's structured very differently from how ATT is structured, even though they're both big camps. But I think that also, in very different ways, is at the very top of the game. I think Matt Hume might be the single best coach in MMA, though damn near impossible to work with, apparently. Tristar is up there. I don't know. Who occurs to you, Connor?
We're mostly looking at, like, North American teams, but we also have to consider a few really notable camps from outside. I mean, those are just the ones we are most familiar with and the ones we see the most fighters from. But there's Nova União in Brazil, which is apparently mostly devoid of top fighters these days. It seems to be kind of collapsing.
Everybody's left, man. Like, I mean, and because Pederneiras isn't really doing much anymore.
Right. It was kind of a team like built around Pederneiras, it seemed, and he was really busy and really involved, and he talked about not wanting to be as involved, and maybe that's what's happening now. But there's also teams like Tijuana's Entram Gym's probably the best gym in Mexico, All Stars in Sweden, Rumble Sports in Denmark. But in the biggest ones we're talking about is probably going to be ATT, TriStar, Kings, Jackson Wink, and I guess at this point we should probably include Combat Club, where Henry Hooft has joined Gilbert Burns and basically taken...
AKA, too.
Oh, AKA, of course. But at Combat Club, that's Henry Hooft and Gilbert Burns and pretty much every single member of the Black Zillions team. So Anthony Johnson, Volkan Oezdemir, Michael Johnson, every ranked fighter from Florida who isn't an ATT fighter is basically now at Combat Club. And it's basically the same team. So I guess those are the ones we're talking about. Combat Club, ATT, AKA, TriStar, Kings, Jackson Wink.
Yeah, and there are good gyms. Oh, there's also Mark Henry's crew.
Sure,
in New Jersey. There's Sarah Longo.
Yeah.
There are others. Like, it's not like these are the only ones.
Yeah, Mark Henry has to be talked about, I think, because he has enough. I mean, the guy has Frankie Edgar and Eddie Alvarez and Chris Weidman
Barboza
and Marlon Moraes. So yeah, he's got to be in the conversation. That's a lot of ranked fighters for a relatively small team.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are our options that we're looking at, basically. We've talked about the way these camps work. Why specifically, like, what do you see from ATT that makes you say that it stands head and shoulders above the other camps? And why is that?
Okay, so I think on a basic level, it's because we see so many top fighters from there.
Yeah.
But that is not in itself evidence that it's the best camp. It's what makes all those fighters as good as they are, and in what ways is that traceable to ATT. So I think what we see from all of their fighters in every phase is really sound fundamentals, right? So you don't see ATT fighters who are doing things that are just absolutely fundamentally screwed up. I mean, and you see, like, when Ioana Jędrzejczyk, she's now had 2 full camps at ATT, correct? Like, her fundamentals are better than they were.
Yeah.
She is sharper with her combination. She's sharper with her balance. Her takedown defense is sharper. Like, she is a clearly better technical fighter than she was when she got there a couple of years ago, which is wild considering how sharp she was in the first place. So if you can take a fighter who's already at the very top of their game and sharpen them, that says a lot about what you can do.
Go on.
No, go ahead.
Well, do you think the thing they do at ATT is give fighters such sharp technique that they can prepare for everything, or I also think of them as a strategizing team. A team who does a really good job with guys like Dean Thomas and Mike Brown of equipping their fighters with the perfect game plan. Like, not only has Jędrzejczyk improved technically, but she's a great example because the strategy she used against Kowalkiewicz in her first ATT fight was basically perfected in her next fight against Andrade. Those weren't just good fights from a technical perspective. The Andrade fight was a strategic masterpiece. It was the exact right way to fight that opponent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the flip side of the coin. It's not just that they're giving their fighters the right technical tools. It's also like they're clearly doing the work in terms of game planning and strategizing and implementing a game plan both before the fight in terms of preparing their fighters, but also making adjustments in the fight. You know, I think so. I think they've mastered both of those things, and that to me is what makes them the very best. Like, a fighter at any level can go there and get better on a variety of levels, and they're maximizing the talent and skills of their fighters.
Yeah. So before we run through the other teams, is there somebody you think like exemplifies the ATT style, the ATT, the thoroughness of preparation? Like, who exemplifies that team for you and why?
So I think there are two options. There's one that we talked about beforehand, and I'll mention him here. I think Jorge Masvidal.
Yeah.
Simply because he does everything right. He does everything right and has for many, many years now. You know, like, there's nothing that you can point to in his skill set that is in any way lacking. And I think that when you combine that with increasingly good game planning, what you get is his recent run. But also, I would say Dustin Poirier, because a very different fighter than Jorge Masvidal. Very different in terms of approach, skill set, and things that work well for them, but also exceptionally fundamentally sound in a variety of different phases. Well trained. His coaches clearly game plan well for him, and put him in position to make the best use of the skills that he has. Yeah,
I guess the one thing you could say about fighters at ATT, it may be the most consistent team where if a fighter who needs to round out their game, or maybe they're a young prospect, or they started late or whatever, anybody with any kind of marked limitations, it seems more than any other team that if they go to ATT, they will improve. There are other teams where people really don't mesh, but ATT is the ultimate big team. It's not one where maybe you don't get along with the coaches. It's like I think it seems like it can be a little cliquish from time to time, ATT. Like, you have groups of friends who work together. Training partners are more the groups than just the coaches. But it has a strong set of coaches at the top who are dictating why everything is being done the way it is. And so whether it's somebody like Thiago Santos goes there and suddenly becomes a way better wrestler and a better boxer, whether it's like a Krzysztof Jotko learning to be a little more aggressive, like, given enough time at ATT, it does seem that more than any other gym I can think of, fighters improve. They get
Santiago Ponzinibbio, another great example.
Ponzinibbio is a great example. Yeah. Even Jędrzejczyk, like, no matter how good you are, ATT makes you better. So I think it's fair to say that right now it's probably doing objectively the best job of any team in MMA. But why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, we're going to talk about some other teams, compare them to ATT, maybe why they are not as good as ATT, or why they're good in very different ways.
Just why they're different too,
right.
And what that difference says and means, because you can have differences where you don't have to put a value judgment on it, and some things work differently for different people. Because
you can't say that ATT is objectively better than AMC Pankration as a team, because ATT produces the highest number of rapidly improving fighters, but AMC Pankration and Matt Hume has the best fighter in the world. They have Demetrius Johnson. So it's a matter of specialization. And what each camp is really good at. So we'll get into more of that, talk more about fighters who exemplify their teams, and then remember at the end of the show, we're going to talk about our favorite, or the most dangerous, in our opinion, unranked fighters in the UFC. All of that after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Other teams on our roster here. Let's go ahead and move on to a team that we have talked very highly about for a very long time. Let's talk about Kings MMA. Rafael Cordeiro. How would you, if we're talking about our two categories, there's two types of teams in the world. If there's the big team and the auteur team, you think Kings MMA is more of an auteur team?
Yeah, I don't think that people understand how small Kings really is and how small the team actually is. Like, you could go in there for an MMA class and there would be 6 or 7 people, and half of them would be, you know, top 5 or top 10 fighters, like in the UFC. So it is a small group of folks. It is not an especially big team. It's a small facility. Guys generally have to piece together like their own grappling coaches and their own wrestling coaches. Like, lots of guys work with a guy who runs like a Southern California wrestling club. A lot of them work with Kenny Johnson, who's at Black House. Like, there's a lot of mixing and matching, which is kind of the nature of the scene in Southern California, is a lot of mixing and matching. It tends to be pretty individualistic in terms of how you put your teams together. But Cordeiro is the auteur type who ties it all together. And when guys work with him for long periods, he produces a very specific, generally speaking, a very specific type of fighter, very specific approach based around pressure and aggression. And that's the way he trains his fighters. That's what he wants out of them. And not everybody is going to mesh with that.
Yeah, I'm going to add a little wrinkle to that, because I think Cordeiro does have some flexibility strategically and stylistically. Like, what kind of, boy, I hope that keeps happening throughout the episode. What kind of style of fighter he can produce, or what strategy he can equip a fighter with. Style and strategy are often different, right? Like, sometimes you adopt a style strategically, and sometimes your style has certain strategies that work with it. Guys like Jake Ellenberger, for example, his last fight, I thought looked really, really good. He fought Mike Perry, and doesn't have the chin anymore, so it felt guaranteed that once Perry got hands on him, he'd probably get hurt, which he did. But he fought him from the outside, taking angles, using his jab, pot-shotting and countering, basically, and got aggressive in bursts, but I think Cordeiro wanted him to be evasive and maintain distance. And we know that Beneil Dariush can do that at times as well, as can Fabricio Verdum. Rafael dos Anjos, who's no longer at Kings, but even when he was probably the guy who most exemplified the pressure style. But everybody else, you know, guys like Machida, like Gastelum, even like Shogun, like everyone else who's worked with Cordeiro, has been able to do some fancy shit from outside as well. I think maybe the real limiting factor of working with Cordeiro is, some of this is just going by what I heard, but I'm sure having trained with Fabricio Verdum, who's a longtime King student, you can corroborate some of this, is how hard it is to train there. It's more like an AKA environment from what I've heard, in that there's a lot of very hard sparring all the time.
It's hard physically. Yeah. No, I think you're right about the flexibility. Cordeiro is not a one-trick pony at all. It's just what ties all of his guys together tends to be aggression. That doesn't necessarily mean pressure.
Right, yeah. More than any other coach, he seems to value, like, technical aggression. Being good at being aggressive, not just being a wild man. And so even guys who
thinks the point of a fight is to kick the shit out of the other guy.
Yeah.
Like, really and truly, he thinks the point is to kick the shit out of the other guy, and that's how he's always trained fighters, going back to chute box, and it's how he trains his fighters now. I mean, the tools are different, and he's a pretty introspective guy in terms of picking things up. Like, his fighters do not throw the same combinations that they did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
They don't there has been a lot of evolution. His guys use the cage really well. I think he understands better than just about anybody else the value of pressure and what the cage does for you as a fighter.
And this is a guy who came up before the cage was a thing. I mean, who fought in Vale Tudo and who trained guys for Pride, who most of, I guess, probably more than half of his career as somebody involved in mixed martial arts was not in a cage, but he's adapted well, which proves that he is a thoughtful trainer.
He told me about that when I interviewed him. He's like, when I moved to the United States and I started training guys who were fighting in cages, I stopped and and when you could use elbows and you couldn't soccer kick anymore, he's like, yeah, no, I reevaluated absolutely everything.
Boy.
He's like, I learned more about wrestling. I spent more time grappling. We worked on ground and pound.
How many soccer kicking setups and techniques have we lost that Cordeiro probably knows now that they're not allowed.
They still train them from time to time. We trained them from time to time because one of his students was my coach for ever and ever.
But that's maybe the thing that limits who can work well with Cordeiro, who's willing to go there. It's like, why am I getting soccer kicked in class? I think we've identified the thing that Cordeiro does better than any other coach, I think, or at least there is nobody who surpasses him, is understanding cornering of fighters, understanding, even in training outside of the fight, but understanding what he says and how he says it, how he builds his fighter, how he directs them will affect their performance. He understands that very, very fully. We know he's really big on confidence, but there are a lot of trainers. Like Henry Hooft, we both agree, may be the best striking coach in MMA. There's not a ton of competition. He's really up there. And yet, even though I think he's obviously been working on this, Henry Hooft has been kind of a thoughtless cornerman for a long time. Not that he's not thinking about the fight and what should happen, but he does not necessarily think about how he should be talking to his fighter. And that is what Cordeiro is introspective enough and thoughtful enough that he spends a lot of time thinking about those things. So I can imagine that before, in the 10 seconds as he's taking the stool to the corner or whatever and walking up to his fighter after a round, Rafael Cordeiro is the kind of guy who will think, how am I going to phrase this advice? How am I going to tell my fighter what to do? I know what he needs to do, but how am I going to tell him? And that's the best thing you can say about King's MMA is that everybody who goes there comes out looking really confident, really mean, like they don't have any fear when they're done with a camp at King's MMA. I think Cordeiro kind of stands alone in that regard. There's nobody else who quite matches him there.
I think Greg Jackson, as somebody in the corner, is somebody who really understands the psychology of a fighter. Someone
who really thinks about their approach, especially to each specific fighter. Like Cordeiro's approach works for everyone, but maybe Jackson's even better at tailoring. Am I going to use a Russian accent for this guy? Or
I think that's exactly it. I mean, I think Cordeiro's approach is very heavily designed around confidence. And the longer I spend watching fighting, the more I think that confidence is really the thing that determines whether you're going to win or lose a fight or not. Do you trust yourself to do the things that you know you need to do to win the fight?
Guys, you heard it here first. Conor McGregor by 4th round TKO over Floyd Mayweather on August 26th. Confidence matters.
Yeah, it's the only thing. No, I mean, it really, like, what good does it do you to know how to throw 17,000 different combinations and throw them with perfect technique if you can't pull the trigger on it?
Right.
If you can't make yourself do it. We see less skilled fighters beat more skilled fighters all the time by sheer force of will. Like, I don't want to take it too far because obviously technique matters. And that's one of the premises of this show, I think, is that, digging into how and why things happen in a fight is meaningful, that analysis is good. But there is a point where you need to be able to trust yourself, and Cordeiro is really good at getting guys to do that. And Greg Jackson is too.
I would say confidence is like a second, or technique is really even if I call it fundamental, and I think it is, it's a second tier in terms of importance to things you need to have as a fighter. There are certain things that without them, you just will not succeed. If you have a terrible chin, then you're going to have a hard time. If you are not confident, no matter how clean your punching technique is, you're going to suck when you fight. If you are, if you're bad, you don't make decisions well under pressure. Maybe you are insecure or whatever. All these things can hold somebody back. It's a little bit like making a movie is like a big collaborative effort. And I think I said this on the Depressed Us, but making a movie is a big collaborative effort, and it's almost a miracle that any movie turns out well, because there's like 900 people involved in coming up with what we think of as being one person's idea. And a fighter is kind of the same way, that there's so many elements that can go into allowing you to succeed in MMA, one of them missing. If one step of that collaborative process goes wrong, you're not going to succeed. But technique is one of those things, like a confident fighter with technique is always going to be better than a confident fighter without technique. And sometimes a non-confident fighter with technique will surpass a confident fighter if he truly doesn't have the technique at all. Cordeiro, I think, does a really nice job of marrying the two, where his fighters, they get better going there. Their combination punching is superb. Their cage cutting footwork is really good. They understand distance. They use their defense aggressively. But
they counter really well.
Yes, but the one thing you can say about Cordeiro's fighters is they never hold themselves back from attacking an opportunity because the position isn't perfect. They are never fighters who wait for the perfect punch. They will take a good punch every single time it opens up.
Yeah, I suppose with the exception of Verdum's last fight, but
sure.
I honestly think he's just old as hell and kind of shot.
Yeah,
so like nothing. No, there's no coach in the world who can train, decades of wear and tear back out of your body.
Right.
That guy doesn't exist.
Like
and
I said,
especially
with Ellenberger's last fight, like a great preparation, obviously looked good. Nothing Cordeiro could have done to make him win that fight, to guarantee him victory there.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's an argument in the aggregate that like Cordeiro might shorten his guys' careers, might shorten their prime years by virtue of how hard he trains them. And the same is probably true of AKA, that like iron sharpens iron only takes you so far. Like how many times has Cain Velasquez been in the cage in the last 4 years?
I think it's definitely true. I mean, Shogun Rua probably would have had a better prime, maybe, had he not been going to so many gym wars at Shooter Box. Cain Velasquez could have very well been the greatest heavyweight we've ever seen. And we didn't get to see most of his prime career because of all the injuries. I think there's a very real argument to be made that there are limitations to that kind of hard training style. Who do you think right now exemplifies the King's MMA brand as a fighter? Who's there?
So even though he's not there anymore, I think Rafael dos Anjos.
Yeah.
At least for the period that he was working under Cordeiro, was the quintessential guy because of the pressure, the variety of tools. I think the body kick is the quintessential Rafael Cordeiro weapon.
Hell yeah, definitely.
Because it's a little dangerous to throw it, but it hurts a lot to get hit with one. His guys all throw them just hard as shit, nothing held back, and it wears you down over the course of the fight. It accomplishes strategic and tactical goals at the same time by cutting off the cage and limiting your opponent's movement. Like, it is the quintessential thing. And Rafael dos Anjos threw it better than anybody else.
Yeah. And
I think his performance against Pettis was the quintessential Rafael Cordeiro trained performance.
Boy, the left body kick might be Cordeiro's one move. I think of him as like the knee guy, the pressure guy, but like Dariush, Verdum, Gastelum even, Machida.
Gastelum throws a nasty one.
Machida in his late career run. Shogun always like brutal body kicking is something that Cordeiro fighters all do very well. Yeah. That's a great point.
I think right now it's of all the guys he trains, it's Gastelum. I think Gastelum is the one who looks most like a Rafael Cordeiro trained fighter. Yeah. Because of the pressure, the approach, the and the killer instinct too. That when Gastelum hurts a dude, Gastelum just fucking pours it on.
Yeah. That
is something you learn.
I would mention Beneil Dariush as well. Probably never a guy like Gastelum who's going to get there quite to the top, but like you watch Beneil Dariush against James Vick, that's a Rafael Cordeiro fighter right there. Especially the savagery with which he finished him. Yeah, that's a Rafael Cordeiro fighter. Okay, who else are we looking at? What's our other camps, and how are we going to? So overall, I mean, is there any way to objectively say that a camp like King's is not as good as ATT?
I think different camps work for different people.
Right.
Like, I think that's one of the things that, and I was going to segue into this to talk about Jackson Wink, because I think that the individual talent that they have on their roster and the individual coaching talent that they have on their roster might be the best in MMA. Like, we've talked to Greg Jackson. I've talked to Greg Jackson a bunch of times. Like, he is head and shoulders. I don't think it's close. I think he's the smartest person who works in or around combat sports, period. Any combat sport. Take your pick of them. He is miles beyond what everybody else is doing in terms of his understanding of the theory and practice. But with that said, you can, and as good as he is at the psychology of cornering and working with different personality types, I think you have to approach fighting in a particular way for Jackson Wink to work for you. Like, you're going to go there and you're going to get good sparring and you're going to get good instruction, but at the very highest levels, I think you have to mesh personality-wise with Jackson and Brandon Gibson. And they all think about fighting really in a particular way that's pretty abstract and it's pretty artistic and it's pretty strategic. And to get the most out of them, you have to be willing to sit there and do film sessions after film session after film session. They do film sessions before they go and hit pads.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just roll I mean, maybe you can, and some guys do, but like I think Donald Cerrone just trusts them to do the stuff for him. But I think to get the most out of it, you have to be willing to do that process with them. And I think there are some fighters where that just doesn't work for them.
Yeah, and Cerrone's also a guy who for a long time had his own guy. He would have his own striking coach or whatever to work with in addition to the Jackson Wink team. His has always been a little individualized version of what Jackson Wink does. That's a limitation we've talked about with like Tristar in the past as well. That certain people maybe don't work well with Firas Zahabi because he's so cerebral. You really have to be on that. You have to at least want to engage on that level to get out of him all the shit he knows. And I can see Jackson very much being the same way. Like, even if he's a very good, he's very creative and thoughtful about how he conveys information to his fighters. He's, not everybody's going to want to go in the corner and have Greg Jackson be doing like some weird baby talk to them because he thinks it's the ideal way to calm them down in this particular situation. You know what I mean? Not everybody's going to mesh with that thought process.
Yeah, you have to be able, I think to get the most out of them, you have to be able to engage with them on that level. That's why John Jones is the quintessential Jackson Wink fighter, is because he is a film study savant.
Yeah.
Like, he will just watch things over and over and over again and pick up on incredible tiny little details. And what Jackson looks for in a fighter is not so much the cerebral side, but the ability to make the right decision in the moment. That is, Jackson doesn't care so much about athleticism or even skills, just so much as out of a menu of options that's available to you, how do you pick the right one at the right time?
Do you think that it's something, is that tied to coachability, like being able to listen, or is it guys who make decisions without having to be told?
I think it's a combination of all of that. I think you have to be able to make the right decision yourself in the moment, because at the end of the day, that's you making that decision. But being able to pick the right option is going to be influenced by your relationship with your coaches and by what they tell you and by what you're able to pick up on your own. Because it's not just that Jones flawlessly makes the right decision. It's also that knowing which of those is the right one to make has been influenced by his hours and hours and hours of watching film and his like deep technical discussions with guys like Brandon Gibson and Greg Jackson and all of that. So it's your menu of options is going to be influenced by by your relationship with your coaches and how deep you can dig into things, but also by your innate ability to make those decisions. Like, because Jackson thinks that decision making ability to some extent is just hardwired into you. And he and I had a really long discussion about that because I wasn't sure I agreed with him, But the more I get into MMA, the longer I watch it, the more I think that that's right. That they're just, and sports in general, because you see this with quarterbacks, I was listening to.
That's a talent.
I'm sorry.
Decision making is a talent that you can be given or not given.
Yeah, and it can be improved. Like, you can be, I think to some extent, you can be trained out of the making really stupid decisions. Like, I listened to an interview with Mike Leach, who's the Washington State University football coach, and he's like a quarterback whisperer. Like, he can take any quarterback and teach them and turn them into a record-setting kind of guy. Like, and he's been doing this for 15 years or 20 years now. Like, it's not a fluke with him. But he was talking about this, and he's like, decision making, you can improve it some. But it was clear, like in his head, he wasn't ever going to work with a quarterback who was a bad decision maker to start with. Like that to some extent that was innate. You can improve it, but it's always going to be built in on some level. And I think that's just objectively true. Anthony Johnson as an example of this, incredible fighter, incredible physical talent, not a dumb fighter by any stretch of the imagination, but made bad decisions. And you could never fully train him making some bad decisions out. Yeah. No matter what you did, no matter how long you had him work, he was always at some point going to make a bad decision. Andre Fili, incredibly talented fighter, incredibly gifted, well-trained, has been for a lot of years, still makes bad decisions from time to time. Like, you were never going to be able to get that out of him.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another note on how Jackson plays into that before we move on. I do think that it bears mentioning that Greg Jackson is very clearly one of the most thoughtful cornermen when it comes to coaching fighters within a fight, because of the way he talks to the rest of the corner. Who is Izzy's John's wrestling coach?
Yeah.
Is kind of has a reputation. It's Izzy Garcia, right?
Izzy Martinez.
Izzy Martinez, my God, what a racist I am. Izzy Martinez has a reputation as kind of a party animal and plays into that with Jones and maybe is on Jones. It vibes with Jones in a way that Jackson probably doesn't on that level. And I remember Jackson screaming at Izzy Martinez in the corner as Jones was knocking out Cormier. He said, "Sit down, Israel." He called him by his full name. And because Izzy was getting really excited and standing up, which is also what he did in the Cub Swanson Duha Choi fight. And I think we both remember when Greg Jackson was screaming at his corner to stop getting so excited whenever Cub landed. And I remember very clearly in my mind a moment when he says, because then Cub might get knocked out. As he was saying it, Duha Choi landed a huge counter and Cub was hurt because he went too crazy for the finish. So Greg Jackson really, really cares about how... I mean, he's also the guy who will shout things so that the judges hear. He will praise his fighters mid-fight so that everyone around is thinking, oh, his coach likes what's happening. Maybe he's doing better than I thought. So everything about Greg Jackson is like, how can we maximize our chances to have the safest possible path to victory? That's where he got the sport killer reputation, but it's also why he has persistently one of the very best teams in the world, that he has the most thoughtful way, I think, of approaching fights as a whole, of approaching every aspect of the fighting game.
This was something that we talked about, was it last week or the week before, where we were talking about strategic gambits?
Yes.
And risk. Because Jackson wants to give his fighters the best chance of winning the fight as a whole, right? And so, but Jackson is not, to Jackson, that is not fighting as safely as possible. No. All the time.
Just like Cordeiro. Sometimes the safest way to beat somebody is to get him out of there early. Like sometimes it's not safe to spend 25 minutes letting a guy have chances to hit you.
Yeah. Like, and I think that's what Jackson, I would say, understands better than absolutely anybody, is weighing strategy. Mm-hmm. And what is the correct strategy? What is the correct strategy to beat this guy? Like you know, that may not exactly how and why that may be the case is not necessarily obvious to us, because Jackson is always going to have more information about what his fighter is capable of than we do, you know? And so sometimes like his strategy is going to have to take into account injuries and skill defects and other issues that or psychological things that we as outside observers do not know. But chances are good that like, whether it works or not, the strategy that Jackson picked was probably going to be the one that gave his fighter the best chance of winning the fight. Yeah. Like it's real rare that you look at at something that Greg Jackson does and you're like, I'm not sure, is that really, you know? Whereas even with other great coaches, you sometimes get that.
And there was maybe a period where that happened from time to time. I think now that's the thing is that Jackson, even though it's a very big team, he's more of an auteur type coach than like the crew at ATT. It's really about how well do you mesh with the kind of camp Greg Jackson wants to run. But the thing is that there are limitations to that as well. When like one personality is dominating how everything works, sometimes the weaknesses of that personality. So I think having more of a specific technical focus in recent years with the addition especially of Brandon Gibson, but also guys like Izzy Martinez, like that has really helped Jackson Wink once again assert itself as one of the very best camps in the world. Because now we have all of these. It's more like ATT with a different kind of approach to strategizing. But in that everyone who goes there, who's a top fighter, they're going to have superb technical training in the fundamental techniques, as well as a brilliant strategic mind overseeing everything. Last team that we want to talk about, really, our last big team anyway. Well, I guess we have two more. There's Tristar and AKA. We'll try and run through them relatively quickly. But Tristar... another one that is a surprisingly small camp, I think. A lot of people think because, you know, GSP, Rory McDonald, all of these big names. Tristar is not a massive, expansive camp, and I think it is also more of an auteur camp, where people who do well at Tristar tend to be those who work well with Firas Zahabi's specific approach to fighting. He's not a one-size-fits-all kind of trainer.
Absolutely not. I really think you need to be able to engage with Firas, like way more so than any other coach, except for maybe Matt Hume. Sure. Like I think Firas is really flexible technically, or pretty flexible technically. But I think to get the most out of working with him, and we see guys go there for a camp or two and then they leave. And like I think we see more turnover at Tristar, and I think it's probably because you could get the feeling that you're not getting everything out of it.
Yeah, well, the results are obvious. Like, people see Tristar fighters and how clean they are and how composed, and they hear Firas Zahabi talking, and it's obvious he knows more about MMA than almost anyone on the planet. And you're like, well, I want to go train at Tristar. And then people go there, and Firas is like, no, we're going to spend the first 2 weeks fixing your jab. Your jab is shit.
Yeah.
You're going to go back to basics. And if you're not the kind of person who could sit for 3 hours and have a conversation with Firas Zahabi about footwork or something, or watch a fight and then talk to him on a technical level about it for a long time, you're probably not going to get everything from him as a trainer you need.
Yeah, I think that's just the nature of how he is. And I love Firas. I love talking to Firas. Like, I think, if you are that type, there are very few better people to go to. And because he's willing to experiment with things too. Yeah. Like, I think he's a technical innovator, and he talks to other technical innovators, and he's close to guys like John Danaher, and he's looking for ways for new clever things to do, ways to round out your game. Like, guys who go to work with him are generally better for it. Yeah. But I could see how, if you're not that particular personality type, that's just not going to work for you.
Yeah, he's always thinking, like, what's a way I can block the most possible shots coming my way on the feet? Okay, this is the system of defense we're going to develop. What's the best way for me to escape when taken down? That's why he's now been working a lot with developing like a leg lock sweep and back take game. With his fighters, and he has his 60-second guard. Everything is very innovative, I guess, is the way to think of it. Like, Firas Zahabi is not a guy who he's too intellectually curious to be satisfied with the fundamentals. And I think you have to be somebody, like, I think John Jones might have gotten along with Firas Zahabi as well, because that was his option before Greg Jackson. And you can see somebody who works really well on a personal level with someone like Jackson also working well with Firas. They're not quite the same. Jackson's a little more like arty, I think. A little more sort of...
more abstract, I'd say.
Yes, right. Like, there's a little more like a philosophical bent. Firas Zahabi is like very detail-oriented. He can show you why something works.
He's a systems guy. I think he thinks in terms of systems.
Yes. Every single thing his fighters do is part of a large system that governs all of their options and decisions.
Yeah, like, I think for Firas's systems to work for you, to get to the point where you're doing the real auteur shit out there, he wants his guys. He explicitly used this term with me. He said he has a curriculum that everybody needs to know how to do these particular things. And I could see how if you roll in there and Firas doesn't like the way that you shoot a double, or he doesn't like the way that you throw a jab, or he doesn't like the way that you hit this particular guard pass, it could be deeply frustrating, because you're like, look, it works. Or like, I placed at the NCAA tournament. Like, I know how to shoot a double. But if Firas doesn't like it, Firas is probably going to ride you until you shoot that double the way that he wants you to.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. Go on.
Yeah, but so, like, you have to be willing to get into the same headspace that Firas is in, and that not everybody wants to be in Firas's headspace. That's fair. Right. Like, I think that's totally fine.
Firas is a vaguely autistic headspace for some people. Like, it's maybe a little too detail oriented. They're like, I don't want to have to think about all this shit. I just want to throw the punch. I just want to hit the pivot.
That doesn't make you a bad fighter or not a smart fighter. It's just like, you've got to be able to click on some level.
Firas in the MMA world reminds me, I think he's like MMA's version of like a Virgil Hunter, Andre Ward's trainer, where like Virgil Hunter, you hear him talk about boxing, he knows everything he needs to know about boxing. He's very, very into fundamental technique, technical soundness, and you can see that in the way Andre Ward fights. Very clinical, very cerebral. But other people, because of Andre Ward's success, because in boxing, it's the world of the celebrity trainer. They'll be like, I want to work with Virgil Hunter. He trains one of the best guys in the world. And they don't do well under him. Like, Amir Khan comes over. He's like, I'm tired of working with Freddie Roach, who also, as a celebrity trainer, didn't give me what I needed. I'm going to try a new celebrity trainer, Virgil Hunter. And then Virgil Hunter couldn't really make Amir, because he could only make Virgil Hunter type fighters. But he's the guy who's been with Andre Ward since the beginning. That's his guy. So you can see that when he gets the right student, he can do something magical, something really, really technically perfect. So I think that is Firas. Obviously, I guess GSP would be the fighter who exemplifies what Firas does now that I guess he's not retired anymore. But to me, I think the easy example is Rory McDonald. That's a fighter who is kind of a quiet weirdo who likes talking about fighting. Like if Rory McDonald's going to open up and talk for a long time about anything, it's going to be about how much he cares about martial arts. And his approach to MMA is extremely systematic. Like the least systematic performance I've ever seen from Rory was against Stephen Thompson. And I think he had a lot of shit going on with his busted nose and an opponent who really threw him off after the hardest fight of his career. Every other time we've ever seen Rory McDonald, it has been him making very good decisions guided by very sound technique, but sometimes not like creative enough. That can be the limitation of the Firas style fighter. Somebody who is maybe handcuffed to being fundamentally sound, and that is in opposition to like a Rafael Cordeiro fighter who, again, is never going to let perfect technique get in the way of an opportunity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How about AKA? We'll make it quick and just wrap up with AKA. But that's the other top North American team with a lot of big fighters. It is the ultimate small iron sharpens iron team, but is it really like an auteur coach team?
No, it is the closest to a college wrestling room of any team that's out there,
along with Alpha Male, maybe.
Along with Alpha Male,
yeah, maybe.
Yeah, actually, Alpha Male is the closest analog to that. I've never been to AKA, but I've heard from people who have spent a lot of time there. And this was fairly recently. What I heard was that AKA is effectively coachless at times. That it's basically Daniel Cormier running a wrestling practice and then they spar, and like that's. Yeah, and they do have a boxing coach. They picked up a boxing coach fairly recently.
They got a boxing coach. Work. Yeah, it is funny that it's American Kickboxing Academy and it's really just Daniel Cormier telling everyone how to wrestle.
Yeah. I mean, there were apparently days in the lead up there where Javier and Bob Cook were just like not around.
That doesn't shock me.
It's not shocking at all, but not good. I don't think. Yeah. Probably not ideal. Probably not awesome.
Yeah. And if all of this is subjective, all of this is, circumstance this, circumstance that, I think we can say objectively it would be better to have a little more structure at a team like AKA.
Yeah. I mean, AKA is not where I would send a prospect who needs to learn fundamentals.
Right. People do get better there. Like Gabriel Benitez trains there now and he's gotten better. And Alejandro Perez trains there and he got better. People do go there and improve. But it's through killing themselves on the mat with all of these really good fighters. That's what it seems like anyway.
Yeah, that is the impression that I've gotten from everybody who's ever been there. Alpha Male's fine. I mean, I think Justin Buchholz is becoming a better coach, but like again, I think there are some real serious limitations to that wrestling room style of running a gym. And if either of those places were not full of the kind of talent that they are, that system would not.
These are basically, to me, they're like local gyms that got big. You know what I mean? They're like you go to a gym where everyone just goes there and trains and hangs out. It's a small community, kind of a family in a sense. Everybody knows each other. And then suddenly you take the same exact structure, but you put like 6 of the very best fighters in the world in there, or a dozen of them or whatever, all the best prospects. It's like a combination of the small structureless gym with the brand of like a Jackson Wink, where or an ATT, where the reputation of the gym is enough that tons and tons of good fighters will continue to go there. It's just that at places like AKA and Alpha Male, it seems like that is really the strength of the teams. It's just that they have more. Because
it's not nonsense. Like you do learn things from being around other really good fighters. You learn things from sparring with other really good fighters. Like that's a real thing.
But as opposed to the very structured approach of like a Greg Jackson, where every single sparring session you have is probably going to be geared, if you're preparing for a fight and not just sharpening up and staying warm, then every sparring session you have, every pad session, whatever, is going to be governed by what you need to be doing for this fight. You are not going to be going in there before a fight, probably, and just doing mindless, iron sharpening.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Like, I think one approach is objectively better than the other.
Yeah.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's basically all the teams. Let's pick two exemplary fighters for those two just before we wrap up. At AKA, I guess like it would have to be Cain Velasquez for me. That kind of exemplifies what AKA does really well. Is like technical pieces aren't necessarily great, but like comfortable in a crazy, violent fight, coming forward, throwing volume, pushing the pace. That's an AKA fighter to me.
Yeah. I would say him or Cormier.
Yeah. Yeah. The only problem is that Cain is not fighting anymore, it seems, and Cormier still is. So
apparently he's supposed to fight Stipe, so we'll see how that goes.
Cain is?
Yeah, that's apparently supposed to be Stipe's next title defense.
Yeah, that's not going to happen, right? I mean,
I mean, it's weird when you put it so baldly, but no, probably not. If we were taking bets on it,
I wish, man. I was one of those people who thought that Cain could surpass Fedor as the heavyweight GOAT, but he just didn't get the chance.
Yeah, well, you can't prove you're the best if you can't get the cage.
Is there an exemplar for Team Alpha Mare? Team Alpha Mare? That would be good. As a dressage school called Team Alpha Mare. No. Team Alpha Male. It can't be Cody Garbrandt because he doesn't look the most like an Alpha Male fighter to me.
Yeah, I think it's Faber. I mean,
sure. Well, it is like, Faber's team. I mean,
yeah. I mean, at the risk of being a little too on the nose, I mean, I think it's Faber. It's his team. He runs a lot of the practices. I think it's very much his jam.
Yeah, that sounds fair to me. Okay, well, there wraps up our discussion on camps and teams in MMA. We hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. But it's an important part of understanding how fighters look the way they do. And also, when you're making predictions for a fight, knowing where they come from, what those camps and teams are good at, or say you have a prospect you've got your eye on, you see him go to one of these teams, you can have a pretty good idea if you have discussions like this, or if you've listened to a discussion like this, of what those environments are going to be able to do for fighters. And it's all part of the fun in this in-depth fight discussion world of ours. With that, let's take a break. When we come back, we are going to get to a question from one of our patrons about the best unranked fighters in the UFC. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. As promised several times now, segment 3 is all about a question from Ben Cohn, who has been supporting us for ages, and we just love him. And Ben asks, Tim Means, this isn't a question, but Ben says, Tim Means called himself the most dangerous unranked fighter out there. I want to know who you guys think the best or most dangerous unranked fighter really is. Or we can pick a few from different divisions. Ben was thinking along the lines of how hard a fight this guy might give to the top guys, an incredible finisher who can snatch victory at any moment, or just an insanely tough fighter who can take anything thrown at them and make it a hard-fought win, even over a top guy. So, best unranked guys in the world. Tim Means, I think, has a pretty good case to call himself one of those guys, but we have some ones that really stand out in our minds. We're going to be using UFC rankings for this, even though they're kind of shit. They do sort of demonstrate how the UFC views their divisions, who they see as the big names, and the most important people to get wins over. And so I'll let you go ahead first, Pat. First guy, best guy who is not a top 10 UFC fighter, but who you could easily see beating even the champion or top 5 guys in his division on a good night.
So I think Rick Story is the one that comes to mind for me as the quintessential guy who falls into this category.
Sure.
Not because he's especially deadly or lethal, but because you pretty much know what you're going to get from him, and that can match up in really strange ways with a lot of guys. Mm-hmm. So with a guy like Tyron Woodley, Woodley probably knocks him out or takes him down enough times and grinds out enough time that he could win that he would win a 25-minute decision. But there's also a very real scenario in which Story clinches him over and over and just throws volume and lands volume and throws low kicks and throws enough and lands enough that he kind of ekes out like a 48-47 decision.
I'd be a madman if I thought that Rick Story could not use body shots and grinding clinches to take a close decision over Tyron Woodley.
Yeah,
like
that's just like
eminently possible.
Yeah, you see that scenario. I mean, let's see who else is in the top 5 there. Like, I could see him grinding out a win over Jorge Masvidal in a very similar kind of forward moving fight. Those are real things. Like, he's a tough fight for absolutely everybody.
So that's interesting, right? That's an interesting one because Rick Story is a fighter who, as you said, you know exactly what you're getting out of him. And oftentimes I think those guys make the best gatekeepers. But you could also say it makes them the best contenders if your goal is to get them to win a top fight. You know, like if you have a basic grasp on what the sort of trifecta of, or the trinity of styles is, or our 4 or 5 style types, you could
our
easily
quadrangle of styles.
Yeah, our cheese block. You could easily match Rick Story up with the right opponent. And sometimes that opponent, for a guy who's as good as Rick Story and as experienced as him, is going to be a top 5 fighter. It makes him like he's just predictably solid. And that seems to be the case no matter what level of opponent he's facing. This is a guy who would have who can beat Johnny Hendricks, when he was still coming up, when he was really like still a pretty athletic powerhouse. This is a guy who could beat Kelvin Gastelum. He had a case for beating Kelvin Gastelum when he fought him. There is nobody that Rick Story's ever fought that I've seen where I thought there's no way Rick Story could have won that fight.
Damian Maia, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think Maia was just the worst case stylistic matchup. But yeah. Okay, so who's your first guy, Connor?
I'm going to go ahead and shout out, let's see, Rick Story's welterweight. Should I name another welterweight? I guess it doesn't particularly matter, does it? I will, though. I'll say Zach Cummings. Zach Cummings has for a long time. Do you remember when we had a really heated argument about whether Zach Cummings would beat Nicholas Dalby?
I do remember that. Yeah, that's really embarrassing for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought it up. I just thought.
No, I'm just fucking with you. I don't care.
For a long time, though, I've been talking about Zach Cummings and thinking he's a pretty good fighter. And Cummings is not maybe... Like, he's lost to a couple other guys in this division that maybe before they became ranked, I would have called them the best unranked guy. Like, before he lost to Santiago Ponzinibbio, Ponzinibbio might have gotten this slot over Cummings because he beat Cummings pretty soundly. And he maybe doesn't have, like, the level of striking of, like, a Nordine Taleb, another very good unranked welterweight, to compete with somebody like Ponzinibbio. But on a good night, Zach Cummings can basically compete with everybody everywhere. He's a good scrambler. He has a solid submission game. I don't think he's ever been submitted. He's got power in his hands. He's got timing. Technical bits and pieces are missing here or there, but he is he's just a fighter who's never out of his depth with any kind of particular skill set. You know what I mean? And who's good enough that against the right guy, like against a Stephen Thompson, number 1 ranked guy in the division. Could Zach Cummings use his takedown game and his counterpunching to beat Stephen Thompson? Yeah, I could see that. I could also see him getting picked apart at range. But if he fought right, I could see him out-wrestling and outboxing Stephen Thompson in close.
That's a tough fight. That's what we're looking for here. Is who are the guys who are going to give them a tough fight who could make it close enough to conceivably win a decision or would have a path to victory in that kind of fight. So I'm trying. Okay, so who's next for me? I'm going to go with yet another welterweight, though one for entirely different reasons than the last 2 guys that we've talked about. I'm going to say Leon Edwards.
Love Leon Edwards, man.
Who you might call him a prospect, but Leon Edwards has been in the UFC for 3 years. Mm-hmm. He's got 7 fights in the UFC. His only losses are to Claudio da Silva in a fight that, frankly, I thought Edwards won. It was a split decision, and then he lost. And then he lost to Kamaru Usman, who also I think might be the actual best fighter in this division.
Yeah, and also one of Kamaru Usman's most competitive fights.
Yeah, that was not an easy fight by any stretch of the imagination. And so Edwards is only 25, and he still has a lot of room to get better. Is he 25? That can't be right.
Yeah, he is. He's still very young.
Really?
He's 25 years old.
Yeah, so he's still got a lot of room to get better, and he will get better. But even right now, like, I can see the fight. I can see where he gives, where he just stays away from Damian Maia for 15 minutes,
sure,
and makes it impossible for Maia to get to him, or and he's a good enough wrestler that he can stuff a lot of those takedowns. I can see him being in there and being competitive or winning a decision against Jorge Masvidal because he's athletic, he's powerful, he's smart, he's a sharp fighter, he's opportunistic. He's got a lot of experience against pretty good fighters at this point. Like, he's a dude who could be competitive with anybody, even if he's not beating them.
Yeah, and he is he's not just most of the guys we've named are kind of like they feel, at least at the moment, like they're kind of set in their positions in the divisions, like they're kind of gatekeepers who, if they were used differently, could be contenders. Leon Edwards is a guy who I think still could establish himself to be a contender, although at the moment his style is kind of that of a young veteran, where he's kind of a spoiler and neutralizer, somebody who gives you a tough fight but maybe doesn't blow you away beating you. But I think after maybe the next year or so, I'm hoping we see Edwards' game really start to blossom. I still think I'm still waiting for that, because now we've seen, like, Leon Edwards right now would not lose to Claudio Silva because his wrestling is way better than it was.
Well, he's the kind of fighter who either blossoms into a contender because their game their game takes a little while to fully come together, or he's a guy who just stays right where he is. Like, he's never going to be a worse fighter until he ages out than he is right now.
Right.
Like, there's no decline path for Leon Edwards.
He's like he could easily be for those who have expectations for him, he could easily be a mild disappointment who has a few really impressive surprises throughout his career, who is never out of a fight. And those are the guys we're looking for. So Edwards, I think, is a great shout. I do want to talk a little bit about him. Did you think his striking looked a lot better at the Vicente Luque fight than it did against Tumenov? Because it was quite jarring to me, even as an Edwards fan, and knowing how smart it was to wrestle Tumenov rather than boxing with him, that he seemed to feel like he couldn't box with Tumenov at all. Like he just had to wrestle him. So now he's kind of flipped from being this striker, a boxer, a very good boxer, who got out wrestled by everyone, to being somebody who feels like he has to wrestle every striker. Where's the middle ground for somebody like Leon Edwards?
The middle ground for somebody like that is when they get confident in all the different pieces of their game, and you don't have to think about going into wrestling mode or striking mode when it all just flows. So that's what I mean when I say either he's going to be really, really, really good, but he's not going to be much worse than he is right now. He's never going to get like worse than he is right now.
Yeah, like right now he can beat Vicente Luque and Albert Tumenov, but
which makes him like a fringe top 15 welterweight in the UFC, which is not nothing.
Yeah, but to beat Kamaru Usman, he'd have to have flow between every piece of his game.
Exactly, and that's the kind of thing some young veterans get that. Other young veterans don't get that. Like, it took Gegard Mousasi a long time to get to that point, and even now he's not super awesome at it, I don't think.
Yeah.
Or Jorge Masvidal, same deal. I think it took him a while to get to the point where he felt confident enough in everything to just let it all go.
Sure.
And because that's what you're waiting for from Edwards. Is he going to be confident enough to just let it go?
Yeah. That's basically what I'm looking for from him. But even now, as we said, could surprise anybody. Who are like the top guys in the division that Leon Edwards you could see him beating? Did you say Damian Maia?
I could see him beating. On the right day, I could see him beating any of those guys because he's got big power in his hands. He's a really crisp, smooth puncher.
True.
Throws with good technique. If he needs to get a little more aggressive for me to feel confident in him beating any of those guys. But like, I easily see the scenarios in which he manages to out wrestle or land those good clean shots against practically anybody up there. I think he beats a guy like Neil Magny right now. Or I think I can see him beating a Cerrone, even if I wouldn't pick him in that fight. I could see him something like Colby Covington's a pretty hard matchup, but I could see the scenario in which he beats Robbie Lawler. Maybe not Lawler. Lawler's a tough matchup for him.
But you never know. If Lawler were to take time off and Edwards were too, like, that's the thing. Edwards needs to be a little better at taking over, a little more aggression. But if he gets there, I think he's got the potential. And as at the moment, a solid unranked fighter. This guy is ranked at the lightweight division, my next choice, but in the top 15. And if we're restricting this to top 10 fighters, then I think it is fair to mention one of the most established and most underrated fighters at the lightweight division, Evan Dunham. Evan Dunham's been doing good shit for years. He had a really rough run between 2013 and 2014, where I think I and many other people were thinking, well, he's probably, this is it, this is the end of the road. Now we look back at those losses and realize they really weren't so bad. He lost to Rafael dos Anjos, to Donald Cerrone, and to Edson Barboza. Those 3 fights in a row, by the way, which is a hell of a schedule. Since then, he's rattled off 4 straight. Evan Dunham, to me, is the picture of the well-rounded game, experienced fighter. You look at his fight metric page, and every single bit of information there is promising. It's like, this is a thing a fighter should be doing. He lands 5.68 significant strikes per minute. That's pretty damn good. He defends 63%. Not bad. That also includes ground and pound, so that's pretty good. He scores almost 2 takedowns per 15-minute fight. Pretty good. He defends 80% of takedown attempts. He goes for about 1 submission every time he fights. So Evan Dunham is even more so than Zach Cummings, especially because he has more volume and better boxing technique, and better wrestling and grappling technique. I'd say Evan Dunham is just really fundamentally sound. The only thing that makes Evan Dunham not like a standout contender right now is the fact that he's not an amazing athlete. He just doesn't hit that hard. He doesn't move that fast. He looks kind of unimpressive in a way that like a Diaz brother might when you just see him working at pace. But nobody, it's very hard to match Evan Dunham's game when he is on his game.
Yeah, I like Evan Dunham a lot. I think he is as tough and clean a journeyman as you're going to find out there, in the sense that he does absolutely everything well. And he doesn't have the physical gifts. Yeah. And that's why he's never going to belong in that upper echelon, that very upper echelon of fighters. That's why he's gotten beaten by practically all of those guys. But if he gets in there with Tony Ferguson, that's probably going to be a real interesting round or round and a half before Ferguson finds a way to beat him.
Eddie Alvarez? I could see Evan Dunham beating Eddie Alvarez.
Probably. I don't know. I would pick Alvarez pretty handily in that fight, but it would be interesting.
Eddie's got speed, but if he's not out wrestling Dunham and Dunham's throwing more volume on the feet, I can see that being a competitive fight.
I think Alvarez's counterpunching would put Dunham off of his volume pretty quick.
Maybe.
I think Alvarez would find a way to slow that down, and Alvarez also not afraid to just be a spoiler and clinch you to take away your space if need be.
True.
But yeah, but the principle here is, would Evan Dunham be a tough fight for the number 3 ranked Eddie Alvarez?
Could he?
Yes.
In a 3-round fight, could he take a round from Eddie Alvarez? Absolutely.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. Your next pick.
Okay, my next pick is also a lightweight. I'm going to say Joe Duffy.
Always a good pick.
Yeah, Joe Duffy at this point he's been fighting in MMA for quite a while. He's not exactly a finished product, but he is closer to being a finished product than not. He's had 4 fights in the UFC. He is, I think, somebody who could be competitive with anybody in the most stacked division in the UFC at lightweight. I see him. I see the fight where he beats Justin Gaethje. I see the fight where he beats Nate Diaz. I see the fight where he's competitive with Tony Ferguson, where he sticks Khabib at the end of his reach long enough to land enough shots to win a decision.
Sure.
I see him. I could see how he beats Conor McGregor if they rematch. Beats him again if they rematch.
Yeah.
It's mostly in his case he hasn't gotten the chance to prove it against those guys, so we don't actually know what his ceiling really is, aside from that one fight with Dustin Poirier.
Yeah, I would say that the Poirier fight does suggest that somebody like Khabib getting in on his hips would be a bad time for Joe Duffy.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, that maybe
one would think.
The one would think probably is not even really the way to say. I guess if anybody gets their hips grabbed by Khabib, they're in for a hard time. But Duffy's, I guess, wrestling would be like Duffy, unlike someone like Evan Dunham, is in his prime. He's a pretty good athlete. Like, he's very fast. I think he's got a lot of power. He's got marvelous timing and rhythm. All of these athletic intangibles that we don't always talk about that much. He has a lot more of those than Evan Dunham. Agility, fluidity, those things. But he, unlike Dunham, I think is missing more like large technical skills from his game. That things that still need, like, there's nothing you could look at in Evan Dunham's game and say he needs to work on this area. But with Joe Duffy, while obviously having more upward mobility, I think, than Dunham, is also limited a little more by his technical abilities.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Like not physically, Duffy's there. If Duffy could learn to wrestle really, really well, he could be champion, but easily. His boxing is some of the best in MMA. He's got a good submission game. He's very creative. He's very loose. He likes to fuck with people's heads. Like, he's a confident fighter. Duffy could be a Masvidal in the very near future. He could be one of those guys who just suddenly, sort of later in his career, were like, oh, wait, he's been spending all these years getting really, really good. And can just pick people apart and wrestle with everybody and box with everybody. At the time, though, he's not quite there. So, I'm still hoping. I'm glad that Duffy's still in the UFC, for one thing. Although I will say it does, unfortunately, probably mean that the UFC basically just said, no, you can't have as much money as you want. So that sucks. But Duffy still has the potential to get there, as well as currently being a guy who, if he were to fight Khabib, if he were to fight Eddie Alvarez, I think Duffy could beat Alvarez. I think his defense is sharp enough and he's quick enough. He could outbox Eddie Alvarez. He could. Joe Duffy someday could be the guy to outsmart Justin Gaethje. There are winnable fights in the top 5 for him easily.
Very much so.
My last pick, I'm going to go with. Was this my pick or your pick, or can we share it? We both think that.
Let's share it.
We both think that bantamweight Pedro Munoz is one of the best, most dangerous is the phrase that Ben used, and that's really where Pedro Munoz fits. Stylistically, strategically, he's not close to the best. He takes too many shots. He's a little aimless from time to time. He's not really very adaptable strategically. Like, he will fight harder, but if his game plan is to pressure, he's just going to keep walking forward and taking a lot of punches, even if he's not getting much done. So Pedro Munoz has his limitations, but he's extremely tough. He's very mentally strong, does not get broken easily. And he is like a Ricardo Lamas, like a John Moraga, like a, I don't know, who are other opportunists. Like any number of these fighters we talk about, he is...
Ricardo Lamas.
Yeah, Lamas is the one I always come back to. In that mold, Pedro Munoz could finish any single bantamweight on any given night because he has that laser-guided eye for submission openings, and if you give him your neck in a scramble, he will take it home.
Yeah, he hits all of those different categories. He's durable enough to hang around. He's not a bad striker at all. He knows how to wrestle. He's dangerous with his submission game. He probably loses to all those top guys, which is why he's not a top guy, despite having been in the UFC for 3.5 years at this point. He's got a lot of fights under his belt. There's a reason why he's not in that category.
Sure,
but you also can't write him off against any of those guys.
Yeah, he's a bit of a different one from the other ones we talked. Like the other ones we talked about are mostly reliable fighters, and Pedro Munoz is the kind of guy who could. Like, it wouldn't have been the biggest shock in the world if he'd lost to Russell Doane. You know what I mean? Russell Doane was lighting him up early, actually. But it's also not a shock that when he fought Jimmy Rivera, who has now asserted himself as like a top 3 bantamweight, that he landed 66 shots and took a round from Rivera. And even without his grappling game, was tough enough and game enough that down the stretch, he made it a really hard fight, despite a very strong start from Rivera. There's nobody, I would say, that Pedro Munoz in this division could not surprise or could not at least make work hard. Because even just by being an unfinishable piece of concrete, you have to work hard even just to take a pedestrian win over him. Because you're going to have to just keep punching him for 15 minutes. It takes ages. It's very exhausting. And in all that time, that is where what I said before about like spending 25 minutes or 15 minutes with a guy, giving him opportunities, Pedro Munoz is the guy made for that problem. He's the guy made for the fight in which you don't realize you're in danger and then suddenly it's over and you've lost. So Pedro Munoz could, who in the bantamweight top could Pedro Munoz take on? Like, Pedro Munoz could have beaten Jimmy Rivera. Pedro Munoz could definitely beat somebody like Rafael Sunsao, I think. I think he could even beat a guy like John Lineker, somebody really aggressive who can be kind of thoughtless from time to time. I could see Pedro Munoz grabbing Lineker with a guillotine.
He's a tough matchup for Brian Caraway, especially,
sure,
I think, because Caraway is somebody who spends so much time in those kinds of scrambly spaces. Dillashaw, too, if he's not careful, but that probably ends up with Dillashaw just lighting Munoz up on the feet and outlanding him like 3 or 4 to 1.
But who knows? Dillashaw goes for a really slick takedown, gets guillotined. It could happen. And that's the point, is that with Munoz, whatever allows him to do this seems to have more of that instantaneous finishing ability than the vast majority of his peers. That opportunistic.
And that's something that I liked about Joe Duffy too. To bring it back to that last one, because we kind of lost track of the dangerous side of that. Like, Duffy is really fucking dangerous. Like, his hands are so sharp and so quick. He works at a great pace. He mixes his shots up really well. He's an organic striker. Like, that is dangerous for absolutely anybody, no matter how highly ranked you are. Like, if you're not careful, those are dudes who can end you in a moment.
You just realize how many of Duffy's wins are finishes. Like, almost every single one.
Incredible finisher.
Yeah. Okay, so that's basically our list. Sorry, Tim Means. We didn't pick you as our guy, but I still love you. Still love the Dirty Bird. Definitely one of the best.
Tim Means goes without saying.
Yeah, definitely one of the best unranked guys out there, and always a treat to watch. And thank you, Ben. More than anything, thank you for your question, your topic. It was very intriguing. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Next week, you know what time it is. It's it's going to be the Bloody Elbow edition, the Heavy Hands edition of the Bloody Elbow Care Don't Care, where we decide whether or not we care about Mayweather-McGregor. That's going to be on next week's episode. We're going to find some way to care. It's a weird fight for us. I'm sure people who are fans of the show can understand that it's not an easy one for us to approach from our usual very cerebral, analytical approach to fighting, because that's not really the most interesting angle with this weird freak show fight. But we're going to have a great show for you guys next week. We have some interesting surprises planned, and it's going to be a fun time. It's a spectacle, and that's what this game is really all about at the end of the day. We hope you enjoyed this spectacle. Episode 172, I think, is what we are at. Pat, before we wrap up, what do you have coming out this week?
I have a brand new episode of Tides of History coming out, looking at the Eastern Roman Empire. It's following a family of people over the course of the 5th century, like soldiers and administrators, bureaucrats, and kind of asking why did the Eastern Roman Empire hang around while the West fell apart? So trying to look at that from a micro perspective. And I hope that people find it interesting. People seemed to like the last one on the Eastern Roman Empire, so I look forward to doing more on them. Otherwise, I'm not producing anything new until next week. I'll do some Mayweather-McGregor stuff.
Yep. Basically the same for me. I'm also releasing a new episode of my podcast, Tides of History. But aside from that, I'm also going to be doing some Mayweather-McGregor stuff. I'm going to have a series of videos on boxing for MMA, or the difference between MMA boxing and boxing as it relates to this fight, coming out soon. And that's about it. I don't want to set anything in stone, right? You ride the wave when you got a big event like this. You just take the opportunities as they're presented. So we'll see.
Pass up those page views.
That's right. So we'll see what happens. But next week we'll be back. Mayweather-McGregor. Yes, it's really happening, and we are here to experience it with you. As for this episode, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you all came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.